Welcome to the Parent Matters podcast, where we help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of parenting and equip you to confidently parent your children. I'm Susan Stutzman, your host, and today we're going to be talking about home life and video game hygiene. And to help me do that is the one and only Carly Schrimpl.
Wow. Thanks for having me.
Welcome to the show, Carly. Today, we're going to talk together from a personal and professional lens on how to cultivate good hygiene with the kids in your care.
Absolutely.
So, first of all, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I am a licensed clinical social worker. I've been in the field for 10 years now, and I have worked specifically with children and families the entire time of my career. And video games and screens have been something that I'm really passionate about to help parents and children navigate like what is healthy for the screen world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a really tricky topic because just the past 10 years, things have changed so drastically.
Oh, absolutely.
Practices, the norm, what children are exposed to.
When children get devices.
Yeah.
Things like that.
The limits, right? And even in the past 2 years, with the onset of COVID-19 virus and the even more increased screen time because hey, we don't have in-person play dates, so let's have a screen play date.
Yeah. I think that the last 2 years definitely has been way much harder to navigate as parents. And a lot of parents that I work with feel like guilty about, I did not set screen limits. And now that the lockdowns are lifted and people are feeling more comfortable, mask mandates are being, lifted as well, they're having a hard time navigating what screen hygiene looks like now.
Yeah. And can we reel it back in? Can we change the rules at home? And there's a lot too to navigate with relational dynamics because children have seen this as the norm. A lot of school has transitioned to being more on screen, even if you're in the school setting.
Oh, yeah.
Being, coming home, doing homework on a tablet, again, interacting with friends. I know even just like, this is tangential, but like on our block, at times there will be kids outside and then sometimes it's like a beautiful day and it's like, where's everybody? They can't all be in the backyard.
I'm playing video games.
Yeah. Well, I'm so delighted you're here, that you have this experience, this wealth of knowledge for us to just have a discussion about this. And so let's jump into the topic.
Sweet.
Okay, so we're going to talk about best practices because obviously this is, just as a reminder, the topics discussed on this podcast and the resources that we're going to share should always be considered a matter of personal opinion. They don't reflect professional advice. We're not there with you. And if you or your child need mental health counseling or support, please seek out a licensed counselor. With that being said, here's some of our fun best practices. So let's talk about, first of all, video game hygiene. How would you define that? I know.
Yes. I think
loaded.
Using the word hygiene is also something that people normally associate with like cleanliness of their body. I like to use hygiene as more of a preventative way to prevent any type of unhealthy behavior.
Okay.
And particularly video games, like in excess, like anything, can cause a lot of harm. Can cause harm for, increased anxiety, like poor regulation skills, because what I've been seeing is the more that people use video games is more of a way to like cope or to wind down, even though
check out.
Even though there's no winding down going on when you are in front of a screen. Your brain is, firing all of these connections and like releasing like cortisol, adrenaline, all of these different things. So it's not necessarily helpful as a way to wind down.
Have you seen, so like, I want to keep talking about the hygiene, but I've seen this, and I'm curious if you have, a lack of or underdevelopment in gross motor skills.
Oh, absolutely.
Because kids are sitting so much. There's constricted behavior. There's not as much rough and tumble play or using of certain muscles. And so then when they go to utilize certain muscles or muscle groups, it can be trickier.
Yes. No, I'm definitely seeing that. Thank you for putting that into words, because I was like, wait a second. That's so beautiful how you were able to articulate that.
Oh, well, thank you. But I think it's just part of that, something that I've been seeing, it's like even, something that children, that you wouldn't necessarily be looking for on the outset, but you're like, oh.
Like they're not able to like lift themselves up that way.
Right.
Or like, they're a little bit more like hunched over, or they're not as quick for their reflexes either. When something is like thrown at them unexpectedly or something falls, it's like they're not able to like compute that information.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because then I'm not saying, I err on the side that things in moderation can be fine.
Oh,
and,
absolutely.
video games often, video games are even used. I know in my graduate program, my advisor, he had a medical issue in his brain. And one of the ways that they helped him in reviving some of those connections was actually to play video games, because it actually helps with mental capacity. So there are benefits, but
for sure,
the hygiene aspect, getting back to hygiene, is knowing like what is good practice and what are good preventative measures.
Right.
Like if I was teaching good teeth hygiene,
right,
I would tell my children, let's brush our teeth in the morning, and it's not just that done, it's like, how do you talk about it, you do it with them, you teach them how to floss, you teach them how to, to gargle your either salt water or, your breath freshener act, whatever that is.
I love that. Yeah, so that's more of I think the whole idea of video game hygiene. So I think even when I speak to kids and families about it, I'm more of a boundary queen. So they're like, oh, well, Miss Carly's anti-video game. And that's not necessarily the case. It's more of I am anti-excess video games, because I'm, dealing with integration of making a whole human or a whole healthy, rounded individual. And I feel like there can be a lot of tension with video games and relationships, because it's really hard for kids to stop.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's a lot of questions, or that's a lot of the questions that I get from parents, is how do you get them to get off the screen? Because when they are on a screen, their brain and their body are not really connected with each other. And so when a parent is saying like, hey, 5 more minutes, like even using transition words, and then they're like, okay, it's time to stop, they are still entranced in this stream, in this virtual world of, well, I can't stop because, I'm in the middle of this, round, or...
Yeah. And I just want to name too, I think that's super important that you highlighted that with cultivating best practices, just like anything, you're going to see resistance. You're going to see tantrums. You're going to see frustration. You're going to see pushback, if you will. Like my kids, sometimes they don't want to brush their teeth.
Right.
But the tricky thing with this and transitioning out of it, so a mental thing versus something that you're doing with your body,
right,
is that you haven't been using your body. This is my personal opinion, but like that you haven't been using your body. So instead of like being mad at brushing really hard and spitting with anger, they're like, all of a sudden, if you take something away, they haven't been using their body. So you see like, oh my goodness, flailing or kicking or like, what is happening? Where if they're outside and you say it's time to come in or 5 more minutes, there might be stomping into inside or screaming, but you're kind of, their body and their brain are not as disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that?
Oh, totally. I think you were able to name like why the transition from screen to, reality is way more difficult.
Yeah. And so transitions are always hard. We know this as parents and as caregivers and as people that work with children. So, Miss Boundary Queen, how would you define good ways to set boundaries, or what are some of your go-to best practices?
My go-to best practices is figuring out like the time limit for each child. So typically there's like a range that research likes to show, and that's 2 hours of screen time is like healthy. When I tell that to parents at first, they give me the, are you kidding me?
Well, 2 hours for what age group, I guess?
Well, it's just like more of like a general number. So that's like just generally like 2 hours of screens is like a sweet spot. And so like
you're talking about computers, phone, games, Netflix, everyling. Yeah. Okay.
So that's like typical for like what?
I'm not going to ask you if you keep that.
Oh, well, yeah. So I think that's like really, I think that's really hard. So like I explain, because I do set screen limits for myself on social media. So like my screen limit is 15 minutes. And when my teenagers hear that, they're like, okay, Miss Carly, like, do you live under a rock? But that's at the same time, like, that's what works for me. So like, I understand that this is why it's like, a conversation. Everyone is different, like figuring out what the sweet spot is. So it's, helping them understand like where they're at with their body, how they regulate and things like that. So you can figure out what your magic number is.
Yeah.
So I tend to like have a conversation with both parents and child or teen about like what is realistic. So that is kind of like the first step. The second step is figuring out like how and who is in charge of the screen limits. So it can be a way, like if you're a teen, it can be a way for them to like have accountability. And then the parents are able to see, like based on certain devices, like iPhones, there's specific apps for, Androids and Google that parents can use as well to determine like how much a person is on like a specific screen within their plan. And then being able to shut it off. So that is kind of like a conversation and a figuring out of what's the magic number.
So you're talking about children that can reason, or you can have these conversations with. But what about let's talk about younger kids. Yeah, because I know that children 5, sometimes even younger, are playing video games or are on screens.
Right. And I think too, it's really important to mention like during the week what is appropriate for them, and then during the weekends what's appropriate, because there's also that social element that's going on in the video game world. So it's like really difficult and really hard, or like FaceTime and all of these different things. So I like to explain like what is okay, what's not okay. And as far as like social connections, that's not something that I tend to put limits on as much as the video games and the things on the phone, like the iPad, those specific games. So there are specific times of the day that also can be more beneficial for the younger ones and less beneficial. So like in the morning, it's not necessarily a good thing to do to put a 5-year-old in front of a screen, because their brain is, just waking up, and there's like way too much stimulation for them to be able to compute.
And in the evening as well, it's not a good time to put a child
like right before bed.
Right. Anyone, but
right. But more specifically, if we're giving towards the younger kiddos, that's definitely something to have a conversation about. I think there's a lot of modeling too that goes on with the younger kiddos, like 5-ish, 5 to even 8, of like how to have a conversation about like I'm putting my screen down or my screen away, or a phone or anything like that. I talk to parents about screen-free zones. So like in the dining room, that's a screen-free zone. Like there's no iPads, there's no phones, even with parents, as like a general value house rule. So that way they're being modeled, and it's not necessarily, well, I want to be on this screen because, you know, Timmy is on the screen too. So you get like less pushback because it's integrated and it's part of the routine.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard. I will just name, you know, as a parent with multiple children, having older kids who have gotten to a level where they're at a place where they may have some freedoms that my younger child, I wouldn't necessarily want to have if they were the first. And so, but they see, or they're part of the family. And so there's this, well, she does it or he does it, you know, so why can't I? This fairness, this equality aspect. And also, you know, it's not one size fits all, but there are, I feel like with best practices and boundaries, it's really important that you and whoever you're co-parenting with have a talk. And even if you're not on the same exact page around this, that you don't undermine the other parent in any way, but that you talk, if you're having a difference of opinion, that you go and you have collaborative conversations or contend with each other about why you think something might be helpful or harmful or limits. And then as you're setting up boundaries, you're not feeling like you're fighting two people,
right?
You know, like this system and then this system, the you know, parenting system, and then of two adults, and then the parenting of adult versus child. And sometimes it can be really hard with boundaries to be the only one that feels like they're enforcing it. And so having, you know, team meetings, or I like what you said with older kids, naming, hey, you know, we're going to agree upon this, or having not necessarily natural consequences, but having, specific consequences for, you know, for violating the agreement.
Right. Because I think that with Generation Z and Generation Alpha, they have never had a world where they haven't had this. And I think that they're more attuned with technology, like more than their parents. And so they're able to figure out ways around it. And oftentimes parents say, well, they totally manipulated, they go in around this. And I'm like, well, that's because it's like a need. It can be a need for them because that's their connection to social world. That's their connection to maybe even self-regulation, because it is a tool. It is a way of self-regulating or checking out or whatever. It's not necessarily the healthiest tool.
Right.
And so being able to, and that's like in conjunction with therapy and having a conversation about like what is healthy, what is not healthy, and having those boundary discussions.
Yeah.
Often that it's not just video games that have boundaries.
Yeah.
Like this is more of a generalized concept for overall hygiene, overall health.
Yes. Overall health. I think that is really important that you went back to that. You're stitching back to what we're talking about, right? This overall hygiene and overall health. Right. But I do think that, you know, video games in particular can be a real sore point.
Oh, absolutely.
For parents, especially because, you know, like you were saying, Generation Z and Generation Alpha, like they're growing up with not knowing that the absence of having communication all of the time, like instant access, a Rolodex of anything that they want, right? Like like a term, I'm just going to search that up. It's like, oh my goodness, like even when I was a kid, not that long ago, I am old, but I'm not that old. You know, we still looked at, I mean, there were computers, but we still mostly I mean, my parents had a whole set of Encyclopedia Britannicas.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Like, book. Yeah, and that's like something.
It wasn't like everything's changing, like
No.
Wikipedia, like the history's changing, or
Right.
the information live, real time.
Yep. And so I think that there's also, a phenomenon of like we have an abundance of this. And it's like, well, what do you do with the abundance if you don't know like which direction to go? Or if you don't have clear guidelines, if you don't have clear boundaries, you can get lost. And that's where I think it's really important to figure out like what the healthy number is, what the healthy way is.
And if you think about hygiene, right? Like even food hygiene, like do we teach our children to clear their plate, or do they leave it on the table and just expect somebody else to do it? Do they leave crumbs on the floor? Do they, or are they just allowed to open the snack cabinet at any time that they want? Or are there clear boundaries? And yes, sometimes they violate them, and that's learning and growing, and we have consequences. But like, it's not as simple. These consequences aren't as simple. I just want to name that as, you ate 2 pieces of candy before dinner. Well, then, we're having no dessert tonight. You know what I mean? Like,
so it's like, so these conversations are being had and done like naturally, like in parenting. And I just think that because, screens are such a integrated part of our world, we're having a hard time being able to figure out what those boundaries are. And so that's where it's just figuring out what works best for your body and brain and family too.
As well as taking trusted studies that are coming out, but they're just, it's lagging because obviously the media and video games and all of these social aspects or screen aspects haven't been around long enough to do long studies. But I will say, I think it's important to address sneaky kids and kids that try and work the system, or like, they say their iPad's off, and then, a parent might wake up at 2 a.m. and they see their kids on it, right? Playing games, or, like I'll just, throw my husband under the bus. When he was a kid, they had a box with like the amount of time you could use TV, and we have these on apps now, or, on our devices of like, this is how much time you're allowed, and it'll stop, or, it'll alert you.
Right.
And he like figured out the parent's password, and he put 99 hours for every week, and then the parents are like, what's going on? It seems like you're watching a lot of TV, and children do that now, and it's not new,
Right.
But
No,
he was
not
very
new.
smart. He's still very smart.
Yeah.
But,
And I think acknowledging that, like that's a really hard thing to do when someone violates a boundary. But that's like that's actually like a pretty awesome skill to have for someone to be able to figure out like, okay, I need to figure out a way to get my needs met, even though it's not necessarily a need. It could be, it's more of a want. Be like, I get that you really like this. This is something that you're doing. We had an agreement to it. And so now there's going to be a consequence for it. So whether that is, no screen time for a day, or if it's, reducing that screen limit and being able to check a little bit more diligently as a parent so that they can like earn it back. So I think that, oftentimes children work best within being incentivized. And so I think that when they know that they can earn some more screen time, like whether it be like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, they have more of a buy-in on, okay, like I'm not going to do that again because I'm going to earn it back.
And I find that you have to find something of value. So like, what's their carrot?
Right. What's the carrot?
It's like, is it that they get a little more screen time? Is it that they get more choice, maybe a few dollars to spend to buy a new skin or whatever in their game, I don't know. Again, is an individual issue and plan for each family, right? Because again, we don't know your kid's age, the limits in your house, your values, etc. But I think I want to highlight the one thing that you said about acknowledging it and as a skill. And then also when you do say, hey, wow, you were able to figure this out. How smart are you? That's a really great skill. It seems like you are looking for more interaction or more time with friends. Your consequence is going to be that you're going to lose screen time. But, and this is what I like to do as a parent, is when I give them a consequence or I tell them they're ending something, anytime we're moving to transition, is to tell them what we're going to do or what's going to happen next. So instead of just being like, you lost it, right? Then it's like, no,
that's what they're focusing on.
Right.
More of, not
it's like so your consequence is you get to help me make dinner every night, right? And I like to think about doing something with the child for at least part of their consequence, because they really do need connection. They really do want interaction, and it's going to look very different than the interaction that they thought they we're going to have, but it still is a consequence, but it doesn't punish you as much.
Right.
As the caregiver.
I like the idea of doing something with too, because it helps repair the relationship, because it's still like, even though really smart that they were able to figure it out, it is a rupture in trust with the parent and the child. I mean, they did sneak around. So I think doing something with can be a way to repair and get connected.
Yeah. No easy answer here. Okay. I do want to ask you, though, a question that is, I think, really important to consider.
Okay.
And we'll end with this. But we can connect with our kids using video games and knowing about them. And so I think it's really important that any parent or caregiver actually play the game that their child is playing, at least some, or no. Just like most times I would recommend read the book before your kid reads it, just so you know what your kid is reading. I do. And again, all parenting styles are different, but I like to kind of know what especially younger children are going to be experiencing or going to be doing prior to letting them experience it, so that we can talk about it and talk about strategies and ways that we can work to answer or problem solve anything before it might happen. And again, we can't always do that, but I find that it can be a really helpful parenting tool to help resource children. So here's my question. How do you encourage that or propose that parents can use video games and that knowledge to connect with them and to help this hygiene process?
Yeah, I really love that. I love how you're able to kind of like dovetail, like having the parents be with and having them experience what the video game is like or whatever the game is like. I think that's great. And it just dawned on me when you were saying that, like, what a great transition time that would be of like, okay, like 5 more minutes, I'm going to play a round with you before we get off.
Yeah.
And so there is like already this like nice insert of transition time. But I am going to answer your question. I was just more like, wow.
Because that's not always an option, because, like somebody's
you're
like,
right. It's not always an
might
option.
Be, making
you have
dinner
to be really
or picking somebody else up.
and really aware and really intentional about parenting. And that's where I think sometimes it can feel a lot more exhausting, but like what's more exhausting, being more intentional or having like a tantrum like every 5 seconds. So that outweighs it. I think that, repeat the question again, because now I'm like, wait, what am I answering?
No, that's great. So what are some best practices, or how would you propose using video games and parents' knowledge of the game to connect with their kids?
Right. I mean, you can make imaginary worlds with the video games. You can make it into a real life sim where you can play like Fortnite, or you can play Minecraft or Animal Crossings like with them. That can be something that you can do, or just like having like conversations about like, I played this game yesterday and this is what happened, or this is what I was like into a roadblock, or I created this world. I can't wait to show you later when we have our screen time, or when we have our video game time, like during these hours. So it's not that it's completely gone. It's more of I'm going to talk to you about it and I'm going to experience video game world with you in a 3-dimensional way.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. Awesome. So there's lots of ways to develop video game hygiene in home life. We don't have all the answers, but I think this was a really great start, a really great conversation, because I think that a lot of times it's important just to keep having these conversations, because the screens, video games, our usage of these tools are not going away.
Nope.
But it's important that we are thinking about this, because it's important as we raise the next generation to provide them with good practice, just like you wouldn't want your child never to brush their teeth. Right. Or brush their hair or wash their body or learn how to read, like those types of things. Okay. I have a few questions for you. Okay. Speaking of screen time.
Sure.
Are you accepting new clients at this time at Kid Matters?
I am actually not.
You're not. I know. This is a leading question. Tell us what you're doing for the next 6 months, Carly. Are you playing video games for the next 6 months?
No, I'm doing quite the opposite. I am actually going to be through hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. And I embark on this journey April 1st, and I will be returning October 3rd.
Nice. Well, I wish you all of the best on this hike. I know you won't have much internet. In fact, you're only going to have a satellite phone for emergencies, which is it's going to be great to hear when you come back. But when you do come back, tell us where you'll be.
Well, I'll be here at Kid Matters Counseling in Hinsdale, and I'll be accepting new clients then.
Cool. Well, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Susan.
To talk about this. And listeners, thank you so much for joining us. If you have questions that you would like answered by either myself or Carly, please send them to us at this address, podcast@kidmatterscounseling.com. And if you have found this conversation useful, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join me again next time for the Parent Matters podcast. And remember, don't parent alone.